So let us start this particular session on industrial relation part 2, which will cover about the health, safety and welfare measures. In first lecture, we tried to look at the industrial relation, covering mainly the grievance, conflict and dispute. So if you talk about the industrial relation broadly, you will understand that prior to this industrial relation broadly, covering the Industrial Dispute Act and the other very important act, legislative provision, was Factories Act 1947-48. So these two acts were very important, whereas in case of Industrial Dispute Act 1947, the new act called IR Code 2019, that has been enacted by appropriate government, and now it is IR Code 2019, whereas the provisions related to the employee working, health, safety and welfare, working hours and all, those were covered in Factories Act 1948. And we have still Factories Act into its place, which still covers your health, safety and welfare measures. So today we will try to cover some of the brief provisions under the Factories Act which are mandatory and why we need to have this health, safety and welfare. So when we talk about health, safety and welfare, why we need to have these legislative provision or legal provisions which become binding on any particular industrial establishment. Basically, you can look at the need. If you can imagine and visualize situation, the factory or the manufacturing or the industry situation during the independent period, that means in and around 40s, 40, 45, 48, during this period, you can understand the condition of the factories or manufacturing units. On one side, you are having the most of the laborers or most of the manpower was involved in by Britishers in either army, because somewhere the global uncertainty or global war type of situation was there, and there was a scarcity of people, youth class. So some of the laborers were also in high demand in army and all, whereas the factory situation was very critical. There were very less number of skilled manpower, very less in number, that was available, and every factory manager or factory owner or the people were responsible for running factory, they were exploiting those people, not only in terms of working hours, but in terms of payment, in terms of the leaves, in terms of the health hazards, in terms of the safety. Health hazard means the conditions on workplace, those conditions were not conducive to a normal human being. There were safety concerns. The more privilege or the more concern was given to machines rather than people. You can imagine the various movies of independent period, where the condition of laborer was portrayed in a very inhuman manner. So condition of factories, that was not very good on safety front. And since health and safety were not on priority before this management of factories, so welfare was far behind activity or thing. So this act, Factories Act 1948, this act aimed to address these health, safety, and welfare measures. And because of that, factories, and this was exclusive for factory premises where the manufacturing, alteration, or development of any product or services that was carried out with the help of 10 or more than 10 people with add of power, or 20 or more than 20 people without add of power. So that was in factory definition. So any premises where 10 workers were working with the aid of power, power machinery means electricity, and 20 or more working without aid of power. So that premises was considered as a factory, and Factories Act 1948 provisions were equally applicable on that premises. So if you imagine the situation or condition during this independent period, you will find that there was a need for some legal provisions during that period. The factory conditions about the health was not very good. There was no consideration of the cleaning or the basic necessities required for a human being, like dust, fumes, cleaning, and all. So no provisions were there. The work environment was not good for health. Hazardous processes and safety means there were many processes which were very dangerous, which were involving chemical on the workplace, at the workplace, and no safety provisions or safety equipments or safety mechanism was at in place. So there was a need of proper safety guidelines, safety conditions. And if you look at that employee lifestyle and facilities and challenges, say for example, the people who were working in factory, say for example, women employees, there was no provision for taking care of their kids. There was no proper drinking facility, or there was no welfare measures. So to enable these health, safety, and welfare, this 1948 Observed and Factories Act and the legal provisions were made that if your premises or your institution, your organization, your factory is considered as a factory, so you have to make minimum mandatory health, safety, and welfare measures. If you look at that, silent features of Factories Act 1948, you will find that there were health, safety, welfare provisions we will discuss in this lecture. Thereafter, this act also covered the working hours for adult. So working hours means it was working hour also, it was related to leaves also, it was related to compensatory leave also, it was related to additional working hours also, and it was related to the wage rates for additional working hours. It was related to limitation in additional working hours. Say for example, 8 hours normal working hours. Beyond that, if you take employment, then what rate you will pay wages, and how many hours you can increase after regular hours. So all these provisions were given in Factories Act 1948 from section 50 onward. Then the employment of young person means, this was considering about the young person, means uh, prohibition of the employment of children, then prohibition of employment of young person on certain hazardous processes, and the employment conditions. So all these provisions were also added in Factories Act 1948. Then leave provisions, regular leave, working leave, half leave, then all those type of leave provisions were included in Factories Act, that laborer is entitled for these number of leaves, and how to calculate that formula also. Apart from this, there were also provisions for factories, that if you are not following these provisions, what penalties and the procedures for proceeding in penalty cases. So this was also laid down, that if you violate this thing, you will be you'll required to pay this penalty. And especially in case of safety provisions, when hazardous processes, these first schedule, second schedule, and third schedule, list of industries involving hazardous process, then permissible level of certain chemical substances in work environment, and list of notifiable diseases because of that chemical exposure. So these three schedules were also added as an annexure. So let us take one by one. The health provision in Factories Act were laid down from section 11 to section 20. These health provisions at workplace were related to cleanliness, disposal of waste and effluents. If there is any process in that particular factory where the waste and effluent is coming out, so what is the mechanism that every factory has to follow for disposal of that waste? The ventilation and the temperature, that depending on the factories and the type of unit, it was very clearly laid down that ventilation and the temperature maintenance on the work site is very important and mandatory, and proper ventilation has to be maintained. And in that case, the officers which were appointed as a health officers, safety officers, or welfare officers, they were supposed to inspect that factory premises and look at whether proper ventilation is there or not, proper temperature is maintained or not, whether this is not dangerous to the health of employees. Wherever the process which involves exhaust or sort of output as a dust and fumes, then what are the provisions, whether you have some exhaust in place to make the fumes and dust out of the workplace. Artificial humidification, that means if there is a high humidity in a closed compartment or room or factory premises or workshop, then what are the provisions to handle that humidification? Overcrowding. Now, overcrowding means it was decided that if you employ 10 employees, so how much size of the room or how much space that you have to provide to each employee. And it was mentioned in Factories Act that if for example, if those factories which were existing before enactment of the act, that means before 1948, they were required to follow minimum of 9.9 some unit of space, some minimum some cubic centimeter, some was there, that minimum this much space. And the factories, it was not centimeter, basically meter. And the factories which were established after this 1948 were required to have some 14 point something cubic, this space per person. Altogether this data may be changed because this was earlier data. So accordingly, if you have 10 employees or 20 employees or 50 employees, then obviously you need to look at whether how much space you need. Lighting facility means the proper lighting on workplace must be there. Drinking water, according to your health requirement, drinking water must be there. Latrines and urinals, this is very important. If you have some 250, some earlier it was 250, but I think the latest update that I am having is something 100 or 150 people. If 100 or 150 employees are working in a particular factory or places, then you must have latrines and urinals in place as per the requirement. Same thing as per requirement, as per the section of 20, you must have hospitals. So these were related to health provisions. Look at safety provisions. Safety provision in Factories Act were defined from section 21 to section 41, and section 41 itself especially define about the hazardous processes. So you can look at these provisions. Fencing of the machinery. For safety provisions, every machinery must have a proper fencing. There must be some guidelines to work on or near machinery in motion. Employment of young person on dangerous machines, you must have the clear laid down provisions. Striking gear and devices for cutting off power. Self-acting machines. Casing of new machinery. Prohibition of employment of women and children near cotton openers. Hoist and lifts, lifting machines, revolving machines. So provisions related to the safety of human being on working in factories, that all provisions are covered almost in this these sections 21 to 41. All to 41 means power to make rules to supplement this, and everything is almost mentioned, like safety of building and machinery, maintenance of building, safety officers. You must have safety officers as per the laid down guidelines, that if you have these number of employees, you have to appoint safety officers, and for every next these number of employees, you must have safety officers. Section 41A to H, which was called as chapter 4A, this covers about the provision related to hazardous processes, and this was exclusive. Hazardous processes, if your factory is coming into hazardous processes, say for example schedule as per the listed into schedule. If your business factory comes into that category, hazardous processes, then you must have, the government can constitute site appraisal committee which can inspect hazardous process whenever the committee feels or government feels, and inspection about maintenance of the measures. If your factory is considered in hazardous processes, you have some compulsory disclosure of information by the occupier at the proper place. So compulsory disclosure means, say for example, if you have visited some chemical factory, so you can see that there were some denomination or information that this site is dangerous site, or this is very risky, or this please make a distance, something like that. So the information is disclosed. Specific responsibility of occupier in relation to hazardous process. This section fixes the responsibility, that who will be responsible if something happen, or who is in charge, who is. Power of central government to appoint inquiry committee in case of any hazardous processes or any dangerous you know uh, you know accident happens. Then there are emergency standards. 41F talks about the permissible limits of exposure of chemical and toxic substance. It is listed in schedule 2 or second schedule. Workers participation in safety management. The provision that whenever the hazardous processes are there, so the safety mechanism, safety provisions, safety guidelines, whenever they are formed, the workers must participate into that procedure of formulation of safety guidelines, mechanism, or implementation. And then right of worker to warn about the imminent danger. Whenever emergent situation comes, so the worker can warn through maybe that bell or alarm, whichever is there in provision. Then it comes about the welfare provisions. So section 42 to section 49 talks about the welfare provisions. There are seven welfare provisions, and the eighth one is about welfare officers. So the welfare measures which were there in Factories Act talks about that washing facilities, talks about the facilities for storing and drying clothes, talks about the facilities for sitting, so sitting place at the factories, in the factory, or on the workshop, or platform, that must be given. First aid appliance, so it talks about that for every 150 employees you must have at least one first aid box, and for every next 150 you have additional boxes. It talks about canteens, that wherever there are more than 250 employees employed in a factory or factory premises, then the management must arrange for canteens for these people or employees, and these canteens may be subsidized vis-a-vis or with respect to the normal market. Section 47 talks about the shelters, restroom, and lunch rooms. So it again talks about that wherever there are more than 150 employees working in any factory, so there must be shelters, there must be restrooms, there must be lunch rooms. Other than these shelters, restroom, and lunch room should be other than factory premises or their workplace, or within factory premises, but other than workplace. Wherever there are 30 women employees or more than 30 women employees working in any factory, so there may be a crèche for children. And for wherever there are more than 500 employees working in any organization, so there must be a welfare officer for every 500. For more than 1000, there may be for up to 500 one, 500 to 1 more than 1000, there may be two or more than two. But welfare officer must be full time, regular, on roll, who is supposed to look after the welfare of the employees, look after washing facility, storing, drying clothes, sitting, first aid box, canteen, shelter rooms, restroom, lunch rooms, crutches. So, altogether, even we talk about today, it is very difficult to have all these things, and welfare officer especially appointed. This charge is usually given to some regular employee, but separate welfare officer in factories, that is a mandatory condition. But other than factories, they may not have that separate welfare officers. So this was all